Good morning, guys. Welcome to the first lesson on photography. This photography unit is going to start off by learning how to increase the odds of taking a good picture, and then we're going to move into how to edit those pictures to make certain things pop out and do really cool things with them, okay? So in order to get to the editing, we're going to get through the taking of pictures. And I'm going to be going through this PowerPoint. It's fairly long, so this is probably going to be cut into 2 videos. And it just highlights some of the things that you should be thinking about when you are taking pictures, as well as examples of what I think are good or bad photos, okay? So let's jump right into it. Have you ever wondered why some pictures are super appealing and you look at them and you think, wow, I would love to be there? Why some pictures can hang on walls for decades and have people from all over the world come and enjoy them? And some pictures get absolutely praised by critics. This picture's amazing, by the way. I love this picture, right? And this is steelworkers from when they were building, I believe it's the Empire State Building. And they're just having lunch on a beam that's hanging, right? But some of these photos get praised by critics, while some photos just look kind of off. And it's one of those kind of intangible things that you can't really say exactly what it is that you don't like about the picture, but something seems not right with the picture, okay? And that is what we are going to be discussing in this presentation, is why some things look awesome and are really good pictures, and why some pictures just look like there's something not right about the pictures, okay? And that is composition. Now, composition is interesting to me. It's fascinating because it's one of the things where you could follow all of the rules that all of the people put out for composition and still have a picture which doesn't look that appealing. And you can also have it where you don't really follow any of the rules and your picture looks spectacular. There is nothing really black and white about photography, unless you put a black and white filter on it. But there's nothing black and white with respect to how to make a good picture or what makes a picture good. It's all kind of this gray area. And a lot of it is going to come down to personal preference, yes, but there are some things you can follow to better your chances of getting a successful and a good-looking picture, okay? And that's what we're going to be covering. As this disclaimer already went over, photography is far from a science. It's subjective. The rules should be taken with a pinch of salt, or a grain of salt, I believe is the correct phrase, whatever. Right? It should be taken with a little bit of salt. If you don't like the rules that we go over, it doesn't really fit in what you're trying to do, then ignore them. And if you find a great picture which ignores a bunch of the rules, go ahead and take it anyways. Okay? But the thing that you need to realize is that good pictures are not just accidents. Good pictures are created. Good photographers are good photographers because they know how to take good pictures. It's not that they just point a camera, click a whole bunch of times and say, oh, this one's amazing, I'm going to pick this one. No, they know exactly what they're doing. Okay, so they do not happen at random. You need to make sure you put in the effort in order to get a good picture. Okay, there's planning involved in this as well. Okay, so how do you create good pictures? Well, learn the guidelines, and these are what some of the guidelines are. This is a cool picture. The resolution's off, and it's because I found this at a low resolution, and I made it a lot bigger, so everything looks a little bit fuzzy. A good rule of having good pictures is have a good camera as well. If your camera is not very good, you could take the best composition picture in the world and it would still look a little bit off because it's going to be grainy and stuff like that. Like, you do need a good quality camera to take good quality shots. Okay? But anyways, the first focus we're going to talk about, and probably one of the most important, is knowing your focus. You need to know what your subject is in a picture, because if you take a picture and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, it's going to distract the viewer from what they're supposed to be looking at, and you're not going to show your subject the way that you want it to be shown, because you're going to be the viewer is going to be looking around all over the place and not really sure what to focus on. So it is important to keep it simple. Okay, so part of knowing your focus is going to be simplicity. Look at this picture here. There's a lot of stuff going on in it, and it's kind of got a lot of cool elements to it, but there's too many, right? There's the big cactus on the left-hand side, and then the tree, and then the telephone booth. There's a lot going on. What are we supposed to be focusing on here? Is it the cactus or the tree or the phone? It's just a really busy subject, and looking at it kind of, rather than making you go, ooh, that's a nice picture, it makes me kind of go, I don't really know how I feel about it, because there's just so much there. Right? So you need to keep your pictures a little bit more simple. Take a look at this one here. Okay, the first one has a split focus as well. You've got the picture of the girl in the waterfall, right? And it's supposed to be a really nice looking photo where there's this person next to a waterfall. But the way it's set up in the first one, you've got the waterfall on the left-hand side, you've got the girl on the right-hand side, and because they're side by side, there's almost two different subjects here, and you're not sure which one to focus on. But looking at the second picture, all the person did was rotate themselves, and I guess rotate the girl a little bit as well, and it's basically the same picture, but now you have a very clearly isolated subject and a very clear background to the picture, where the waterfall is clearly not the focus, it's in the background, and the subject is isolated in the front, as opposed to having them side by side. And that confusion, it's one very nicely layered picture. Okay, so know your focus, make sure your picture is simple and there's not too many different subjects in your picture. Okay. Another thing, and this is the background, this goes hand in hand with the simplicity thing as well. Don't have an overly busy background. If your background there's too much in your background, it's going to take away from the subject, or if it takes away from your subject in any way, it's too busy. So this is, again, the same picture, seagull on a lamppost. Why would you take a picture of a seagull? I don't really know, but I guess they look nice to some people. But on the left-hand side, you've got the seagull on a lamp, and in the background, you've got the pine tree, it looks like. That's taking away from what the subject is supposed to be, which is the seagull. And on the right-hand side, you just have a clear blue background. Yeah, there's a cloud in it, but you can tell it's just a sky, and it's not taking away from the seagull at all. So it almost looks majestic. Okay? Almost, but it's still a seagull. So having a simple background is going to be something which will highlight your subject a little bit more because nothing's taken away from it. And a good way of doing that is just having a completely blank background as well. That will ensure that there is nothing to take away from your subject. It doesn't have to be black, but having like a solid color will make sure that the subject is very clearly highlighted because there's literally nothing else going on. Okay? And then there's two different things that you can do in order to change the focus a little bit or help clarify the focus by disrupting the background, and that's blurring it out. And you can do that in two different ways. One is using your camera settings if you've got a high enough quality camera. It's called the aperture setting, and that will cause you to focus only what's in the foreground, and everything in the background becomes blurred. Okay? Or you can do this in editing software, after you've done taking the image. And we're going to talk about how to do that when we get to that section, because it's actually pretty easy to do if you know what you're doing, okay? So here's a couple pictures where the background has been blurred out in order to keep focus on what the subject is supposed to be. And the subject here is the really cool reflection you get in the raindrops. And the subject here is going to be just this one here. Yeah, there's a little bit going on over here, but it's the grain. It's, I believe, wheat. But the wheat that's in the foreground here, everything else has been blurred out. Okay, slightly yes, but it's blurry enough that it's clear this is the focus. And that's a very artistic way of making sure your background is not distracting from what you want the focus to be. Okay, so know your focus, keep your picture simple, make sure your background is not disrupting. If you know what your focus is, then go ahead and make sure that that focus is filling the frame. Either get a little bit closer to the subject or zoom in a little bit. Now, recognize if you don't have a good quality camera, if the resolution isn't very good, if you zoom in, it will take away the quality. So just keep that in mind. But fill in the frame with your subject. Yeah, you've got a really cool picture of a stork here, or whatever bird this is. Right? But when it's zoomed in a little bit, it looks a lot more impressive, and you can start to see a little bit more detail in the face, and it's just a much more pleasing image of that bird than the first one was. Right? There's also a greater contrast between the dark blue and the white, which also helps make it look a little bit more pleasing, yes. And they may have done that in editing after taking the picture. I don't really know, but this picture where you have your subject actually filling the frame is a lot nicer. And here's another example here, the picture of the kid in the grass. Yeah, that is a pretty cool picture, but this one is so much more pleasing because you actually have the subject taking up more of the picture. So don't be afraid to have your subject also take prominence in your picture. And because you want to take a picture of your subject in the first place, that should be where your mind is going in the first place, okay? So fill your frame with your subject. And the final thing is cropping. This is again, tied to knowing your focus and simplicity and everything like that, cropping is a very good way to narrow the focus on an image. If you take a really good picture, but there's too much going on in it, it's pretty easy just to crop away everything that can be causing a distraction, and that is going to be done in the editing software, and it's very simple to do, and we're going to be going over how to do that, but it allows you to cut out everything which is distracting in your image and only keep the good stuff. Okay? Here's another example where you wanted a picture, and this goes in the same subject lines as filling the frame, right? Your subject was supposed to be this guy, but you took a picture with a lot of stuff going on, crop everything out, and then your focus is, your subject is filling the frame. It's a lot more simple, and there's less distraction going on in the background, and it's a much better image simply by cropping. Okay? So that was guideline number 1, know your focus. Guideline number 2. This one is really cool because it's not intuitive, really. This is not something that most people expect, but if you want your picture to look better, you do not center your subject in the photo necessarily. It helps to have your photo roughly divided into thirds as this grid, and then you want your subjects to be along these lines, ideally appearing in one of these cross sections here. That should be where your subject is located, which, again, that's not what we're used to, but it creates a more visually pleasing picture. And the rule of thirds is kind of an approximation. The real rule, I believe, is it's the golden ratio of 1 to 1.6127 or something like that. Like, there's a mathematical ratio for beauty, and it's not going to cause things to be centered. It's going to be roughly in thirds. So this is a very easy way of doing it rather than, worrying about the math behind it all. It's the rule of thirds. Okay? So don't center your focus. Have it off on the side. So the lighthouse here lines up with this line. The horizon lines up with this line, and you get a very pleasing image. If this lighthouse was centered and you had the horizon in the middle of the picture as well, it would not be nearly as pleasing. But just simply shifting your focus a little bit and having it slightly off center will align it with this line here and make a very pleasing picture. And a lot of cameras will have the ability now, the digital cameras, you will have the ability to put this grid on your, screen before you take the image so you can line it up yourself, okay? Which helps, obviously, but don't necessarily try to center your shot. Try to keep your subjects along these rule of thirds lines. Here the subject, again, close to the bottom left, with the bridge almost exactly across the top third, and again, a very pleasing image. And here's an example of one where it's a stone monolith, or whatever you want to call it, somewhere in Arizona or a desert, I don't know. But you have it centered on the left-hand side, and you have it along the rule of thirds on the right-hand side. And I personally do not like this picture very much. And this one, it is a lot more pleasing. And it's one of the things where it's hard to define, because I look at the first one, and yeah, it's a nice picture. I look on the one on the right, and I think that's a very nice picture. It's this feeling I get about the picture more so than anything specific, but it just feels like a better picture to me. So I like it more. Okay. Hard to define, yes, but by using the rule of thirds, you can create pictures where people look at it and feel like it's more appealing. Okay. So that is the second thing. Guideline number 3 for photography is balance. Balance is something which is unfortunately fairly hard to define because there's a lot of different elements which go into creating a balanced picture. But we're going to start it off hopefully fairly simply, and as you guys progress in your photography, you will start to tie these into things that you're actually seeing, and it's going to make a little bit more sense, I hope. Okay? So the idea of balance is the same as using a teeter-totter. Just picture that there's like a fulcrum in the middle of your picture, and you can't have too much weight on one side or it's going to tip over. You want it to remain level across, right? That's the same sort of idea in photography, but the weight that we're talking about here is going to be visual weight as opposed to physical weight, okay? So we need to worry about what causes visual weight. Well, there's a lot of things that cause visual weight. Balance comes down to basically things that draw our attention, which is what visual weight is roughly going to be. And things that grab our attention in a picture are going to be things where there's high contrast, like a really bright color in the middle of a really dark color, items that are in focus, especially when the rest of the photo is out of focus, like we saw earlier on in the presentation, right? That's going to cause our attention. Bright spots, bright colors, large items. People and animals have a lot of weight. The eyes of your subject carry an immense amount of weight because automatically as human beings, we look at other people's eyes in order to see them, right? And also the direction that your subject is looking or moving will have a little bit of weight to it as well, okay? But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to simplify it into 3 different things: weight, color, and movement. Okay? And that's what we're going to be talking about with respect to balance. So with respect to weight, imagine that the object have mass relative to their perceived size and balance those things out. So in these images here, this is one where it's balanced because you've got what would be a much smaller object that's in the foreground, which means that they're going to be roughly the same size. And you've got this one on the right-hand side, this one on the left-hand side. These 2 images here, you've got this one centered and this one on the right, which means that the image is going to be tipped a little bit this way. And this one is the opposite, so it's going to be tipped a little bit that way, right? Where this one, they're going to be roughly balanced. Okay, that's kind of the idea that we're going with. Now, I'm not saying any of these 3 pictures is going to be pleasing. I'm saying this one is more pleasing than the other 2. Okay? Here's another image that you can look at in order to understand the illustration of weight. You've got a very large object on the one side, nothing on the other side. It's an unbalanced picture. Okay? So, taking a look at this, you've got your queen on the one side, you've got some pawns in the background on the other side. This is now a balanced picture because you've got something on either side. Right? And you'll notice that this is roughly following the rule of thirds as well, where this is going to be roughly a third. You've got a grouping here at that cross here, and you've got this guy right here. Right? So it's balanced and it's following the rule of thirds in both scenarios, or both areas of interest. Okay? Or this image here is, there's something off about it. And it's unbalanced, literally unbalanced, because what's holding this girl up? You've got a wheel over here and she would be falling over, right? When you add the support over here, it creates more balance, not just because she's not going to be tipping over, but because you've got the balanced wheel over here and wheel over here. If you wanted the wheel to be the subject, then you would want to move that into the rule of thirds area. And by simply shifting this over, including this wheel, the subject here now becomes in the rule of thirds. So that also makes it more pleasing. But the idea of balance here is balancing it with respect to the wheels, making sure she is supported and not going to fall over, because that's the sort of thing that subconsciously your mind's going to recognize and think, something's weird about this picture. That is the idea of weight with respect to balance, making sure that you don't have everything over on the one side and making it too cluttered on the one side or having a super off-balance picture. Now, you can balance out weight in other things. So if you've got a really weighty object, a really big subject on the one side, you don't have to balance it out with a big object on the other side as well. You can balance it out with other things like color. And here's an example of that. Okay? Color will really draw our attention. On the top left of this, there's this window. On the bottom right, there's this really cool image and a whole lot of color over here, and that balances out the object over here because, yeah, you got the object. This isn't an object, but the amount of color that we see that draws our eyes, and that's balancing out the picture. This here, I think, is causing a lack of balance. I think that this sign here kind of throws the picture off a little bit, but this balance between the window, the surfer, and the picture, that's a very, very good way of balancing things out, and color will add a lot of visual weight. Because again, we're not talking about actual weight here. We're talking about things which draw our eyes' interests. Okay? And because color does that, this creates a balanced picture, a more balanced picture. Okay? Looking at these two pictures, I don't actually think that this is a nicer picture than this one. I do like this one, but your subject is supposed to be the landscape of the mountains. And the color here is taking away from that because you're focused, there's too much focus being drawn onto the flowers in the foreground, and you're not really getting a good image of what the landscape looks like. Versus this one where there's a lot more muted and a lot less purple than there is a whole bunch of yellow over here, which allows you to kind of see the whole image. And it creates a little bit more balance on your subject, which again is supposed to be the landscape. If your subject is supposed to be flowers, this is not a good picture. This one is. Okay? But the subject, again, it's all about your subject. And are you adding to your subject or are you taking away from it? And this one is taking away from it. This one is not, which means this one, with respect to the landscape, is a better picture. Here's a really good illustration of balance using color, because you've got your setting sun. The subject here, I guess, would just be the landscape in general. There's not really like a defined subject. It's just the picture in its entirety. And you've got a really bright sun over here, and you've got this contrast in shades over here between the white in the riptide and the dark around it. And this is creating the balance here, upper right, lower left, right? And you've got a really nice balance of visual weight being brought by both of those things. And also it's following the rule of thirds. This one's roughly going to be at the top right. This one is nicely in the bottom left. Here's a line following the rule of thirds here, right? There's a lot of balance in this image, both by the color and following the rule of thirds, which makes it very pleasing. Here's another really good illustration of using color to balance it out. You've got this really bright white waterfall here. Obviously this is shot in black and white, or at least edited to be black and white. But you've got this really large amount of white here, and you've got it balanced off by the amount of white over here. I believe if this picture was all dark over here, yes, it would be a very striking image, but it wouldn't be balanced. And it wouldn't be balanced because it'd just be dark and then one random bright white spot. And there's a lot of light in this area as well because you've got the sky exposed, right? So adding this touch of white down here adds the balance to the picture. Now, that's not to say your picture needs to be super balanced in order to be a good quality picture, because this one does not have balance in it really at all. You could argue, yes, there's a bit of balance, but you've got your subject over here surrounded by a lot of white and then a lot of dark over here. There's nothing really offsetting this image, which is creating a little bit of tension, but I think that this picture needs the tension because this is kind of a spooky, darker picture. And having a little bit of tension in the back of your head when looking at this picture adds to it rather than takes away. So again, following these rules, these are more of things to think about as you're taking pictures, not necessarily hard rules that you have to follow, okay? Because you can take really nice pictures that don't really follow the rules necessarily. Okay. The final thing with respect to balance is movement. A person's eyes or their movement will cause you to want to follow them in that direction, right? So this is one of movement where you've got a person running. Where's the person running to? They're running off screen, which means that automatically there's a little bit of tension that doesn't need to be there. If you have them running and there's space for them to run to, that will be more pleasing. And again, this is one of those things that it's a feeling you get in the back of your head more so than I know exactly what's bothering me with this picture. But you get a better feeling when you're looking at this image because the person's not going to run off screen or run into the wall at the edge of the picture or whatever it is, right? There's movement or there's room for them to move into, and that's important to keep in mind. The eye, where a person is looking, also is going to have the same sort of effect. This person's kind of looking randomly off screen. This person is as well, right? Like it's the same photo, I just cropped it a little bit differently. On the left-hand side, where she is looking, she's looking directly off camera. And there's no real room for her to look, and there's a lot more on the other side of her over here, which means that this one is a little bit less pleasing than this one. Because yes, it's the exact same image, but there's more room for her to look on the right-hand side here and less empty space over here, right? So her visual weight is pulling you to the right-hand side because that's where she's looking. So if she's pulling you to the right-hand side and there's nothing on this side, that's an unbalanced picture, okay? So you do have to balance it out. You have to make sure your photos are balanced as much as possible, and there's a lot of different things which cause that, including simply where someone is looking, okay? So a summary: if you have anything which takes away from the focus of a subject, it will cause the photo to be unbalanced. Okay? And there's a lot of different things which can take away from it. So over here, you're being taken away from the subject because there's empty space and like it's not balanced, so something feels off. Here, this is a very good example of another thing throwing everything off. This is a pretty cool image, and there's this. And I don't really know what that is, but it's unintentional. It's not supposed to be there, and it really takes away from the image. So just make sure in your pictures, don't have anything taking away from the subject of a photo that could cause it to be unbalanced, okay? So keep your colors balanced, keep your weight balanced, and keep your motion or eye movement or whatever it is going to be, your eye focus. Make sure those things are nicely balanced to help create better pictures. That is it for part 1. We went through 3 different guidelines with respect to photography. And yeah, there's a bunch of aspects of those guidelines that we went through as well. This one had 3 different aspects. The first one had 4 aspects. But really, we just went through 3 guidelines. And I'd like you to do the first part of your assignment with respect to these 3 guidelines. Okay? That is all for today. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys around.